and something else, Barlow Trail something, and cider. And we had a couple of kids that played the guitar, and we had a baseball game, and then we had the Barlow Trail hike where we went up the top of Mount Tabor and then down the back side and then came up the front side through the brush and everything.
With students?
Yeah. And it was great fun. And then the baseball game was over and the hike was over, and we'd have dinner, and this was about dusk. Then we'd sing, you know.
What would you sing?
What?
What songs were you singing?
I don't know, just folk songs mostly.
Huh. Would you lead them, or would the students decide that they wanted it?
Well, we didn't have a leader. I mean, I would start them, but we had a couple of students with guitars that would play that, and it was excellent. Then we did that for about 5 years, I think, at Sunset, 5 times. And then when we got to Aloha, I said to Bill and Merle both, I said, we probably aren't going to have that picnic anymore. I mean, the kids at Sunset were disciplined. I mean, they were from, you know, people like you who weren't criminals. And so we stopped doing the picnics, because taking 200 Aloha kids up Mount Tabor, they'd have run roughshod. And
were the student demographics pretty different between Aloha and Sunset?
yeah, I mean, Aloha was at the bottom dregs of society.
What do you mean?
All sorts of rapists and killers. And
Really? Really? What was the difference?
well, it's the same as Trump says about bringing the Mexicans into the country. We're bringing in rapists and criminals. Okay, well, it's sort of like that, because the Aloha, I mean, the Sunset students were a pretty well behaved group of kids, you know, and they were frisky, etc., but nothing that was out of the ordinary for kids to do. But the Aloha kids, they were much harder to control. I mean, like, I think once we did go up there with them, and they'd be climbing around up on top of the Mount Tabor, the mountain. I mean, the crater was there. Okay, and we had our food and stuff in the crater, but above the crater you could climb up there, climb the fence, and be hanging out up there. Geez, anybody that slipped off there would drop 40 feet and get seriously injured.
I mean, that's sort of well, I don't know about the details of that story, but I mean, you know, now that there's this new high school coming in the south of the district, and the borders are getting redrawn, now there's students that are currently going to Westview that are going to have to go to Aloha, and there's students that are currently at Sunset that are going to have to go to Beaverton. And a lot of parents are pretty upset not wanting their kids to go to Aloha and Beaverton, because it's viewed as not as good. The critique of the parents often enough is that this is wrapped in economic and racial terms, like don't want your kids to go with the poor kids or with the non-white students.
Yeah.
Aloha at the time, though, was in the early 70s was an all-white school, I assume, right? Or was that not true?
Yeah, well, you know, I've described that in the way that Bill and Merle and I talked about it. They weren't, I mean, the Aloha students weren't that bad. It was just that they were a more rough and ready group than the kids at Sunset. And it was harder to keep them under control in like field trip sorts of things like that.
Right.
And it would have worked out, I'm sure, okay. It's just that would have been a lot more pressure on keeping them sort of under control. I mean, this was a picnic with the ball game and the hike and so forth. And it was in our control. I mean, we did a good job with that.
Right.
But I didn't want to, and Murrow felt the same way, just turn those kids loose up there when you can't get control of them.
Right. But you're saying, though, the view in the district was that Aloha was not as good as the other two schools?
Right. Aloha, during the whole time we were there, was the lowest level school in the district. I mean, it was like for example, in Portland, Jefferson High School was sort of the dregs of the district. Because it's in that northeast Portland or North Portland area where you get the good share of the black population,
right,
who were from parents that were not well educated and, you know, just didn't have the finesse that they did at other schools like Wilson or Lincoln or Grant.
Yeah, but I guess what I was a little surprised to hear is that you're saying Aloha was always like that. I was sort of under the impression that Aloha that's a new thing. Because when I was there 20 years ago, Aloha seemed like a good school.
Right. No, well, it changed. You understand, though, that this was going to be after they'd been in existence for just 4 or 5 years.
So you're saying in the 70s it was seen as not a good school, and that changed?
And and as time went on, Aloha became a sort of a normal school, but still the lower academic level. And from poor parents, like Sunset had
the West Hills and all that.
They had Oak Hills and the West Hills of Portland.
Right.
Well, then in about 5 years or so, the Oak Hills kids were forced to go to Aloha. And that was a nice area for Sunset.
Right.
And so that increased the sort of the academic level of Aloha High School with getting those kids in there.
Right. And then when that sort of Cooper Mountain area developed, that also changed Aloha's demographics.
Yeah, and that was a richer area when they built those houses in there. And the transition was okay. You realize the first about 10 years of Aloha, it was experimental school.
What do you mean?
We had people all the time coming to visit us from all over the country, the East Coast and the Midwest, etc. And they were interested in talking about the stuff we were doing, which was far different than other schools in the district.
Can you give some examples of what you guys were doing that was different?
Yeah, like for example, student government. We had a government that was most like Sunset had, you know, student body president and secretary, etc. And it was the way all schools were run in Oregon. Aloha, we had a student body president, but we had a Senate and a House of elected people from every reg room. So we had a group of about 60 students, maybe 75, that were part of the school Senate or House of Representatives, and they said a lot of things that we did. Staff didn't fool with it. I mean, and then we had students, teachers in that too. I was elected to the student senate and participated in that. The kids ran it, but teachers could run also, and if they were elected, they'd be a part of it just as one person,
right?
Not as a teacher,
right?
And I mean, we really had a good operation. We taught students on the first 5 years to be fantastic organizers and come up with ideas about solutions to things, whereas at Sunset and at Beaverton, that didn't happen at all. And there it was just a regular student body run by the teachers.
Right.
But at Aloha, it was not run by the students. And that was new in the state of Oregon by then. And then the year after Aloha started, there was that school in Southeast on 82nd. I can't remember the name of it now. They lasted a couple of 3 years and then folded, but they were doing the same thing we were doing. But the trouble is, their school was right next to a city park, and the park was full with a bunch of kids that were not going to school, and had drug crowd was in there, and the students at whatever that school was would go over there and get drugs and during school days.
Right.
It
Now,
was not,
I was going to say, Aloha didn't have bells. Did you like that?
yeah, it was by far better than Bell's.
Was there any problems with it?
No, I mean, everybody got used to it right off, and it was fine. When the clock said 8, 9 o'clock, you changed classes. And it worked out really well. Yeah, no, that was really a nice time. The first year, of course, was in B.W. Barnes grade school. We had 500 students.
Okay.
And that was really good also.
What do you mean the Aloha's first year?
Yeah.
I thought you guys were at the Merle Davies building.
That's it, Merle Davies. Yeah. That was our first year of school.
And was it just like freshmen and sophomores or something? Your first year? I mean, how did you fit a whole high school into that small building?
And seniors.
How'd you fit a whole high school into that building?
Let me think about that for a minute.
Because I teach in that building now. It's not that big. It's maybe...
What?
I teach in Merle Davies now. It's maybe 25 rooms. It's not that big.
Well, we were in there the first year.
Yeah, well, I'm saying it's not that big of a building, so I'm surprised to hear that. That's all.
Well, 500 students. It would, at a grade school, it would hold probably 500 or 600.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And I think, though, that I think it was juniors and seniors in there the first year, but I could be mistaken about that. But that was probably the best years as far as enjoying teaching in there. Because it was the kids. We used to say we were really great at teaching kids to think, creative thinking, and solve problems, etc. But we weren't very good about the academics.
Well, those are skills kids can use, though. They're skills that kids can use, that's for sure.
Yeah. But then, in about 10 years, it began to change quite a bit. We were getting principals that didn't want to fool with that, and they would try to get us back to a normal school like Beaverton High School. But both staff and students were not very good about switching back. And we wanted to keep it like it was,
right,
as an experimental school. But God, all the time I had people coming to my classes, from different schools or school districts around the state.
Right.
In fact, one group came from Brazil.
Huh.
And so they came to see things, but the trouble is none of them could speak English. And so they asked me to go with them down to the Benson Hotel, and they were going to have interpreters there. So I went there, and there were about 20 of them. They were basically some teachers, mostly administrators, sitting in a circle, and I was a part of it. And then they had the interpreter over here. But the interpreter couldn't speak English, he could speak Portuguese.
Okay.
Okay, and I guess
That's not an interpreter if they only speak one language.
Yeah, well, he could speak what they spoke in Brazil, Spanish. No,
Portuguese.
Portuguese. Okay. He could speak Portuguese and something else, French maybe, and then they had a French interpreter that would speak English. And so therefore, it was kind of fun, but it's confusing because they would ask questions in Portuguese, the interpreter would speak it in French, and the French would tell me in English.
It's like a game of telephone.
What?
It's like a game of telephone.
Yeah. Okay, now the interesting part was that if you watch, like the guy that was asking the question, if say you asked me a question, I'm watching your mouth, and you're speaking Portuguese, well, I don't know what you're saying, but then the guy over here is speaking, listens to it, and then talks French to the interpreter who talks English to me. And it was, you had to be careful who you were looking at.
Right.
Because watching somebody speak a different language that you're trying to connect up with English doesn't work. I figured that out. And so you had to look someplace else, and then this English guy would talk to me, and then I would give the answer, and then he would tell the guy in Portuguese, and so on, back and forth. It lasted about 2 hours. It was fun.
Yeah. That's good. I think
I know, you gotta go.
we should break, yeah.